Welcome to the ParlAmericas podcast. This episode was recorded on August 22nd, 2025, during the virtual session, Security in the Age of Emerging Technologies, which was the second in a series of events organized by ParlAmericas in the lead-up to the 10th Summit of the Americas. This event brought together parliamentarians, experts, and hemispheric leaders to explore the connections between critical infrastructure, water, and energy security and technological risks. Listen to law professor Monica Sanders from Georgetown University and founder of the Undivide Project speak about how we can think of critical infrastructure resilience as a human security theme. Professor Sanders also talks about the importance of gender-based approaches and reliable and updated data for the development of efficient policies towards the resilience of critical infrastructure.
My name is Monica Sanders, and I lead the Undivide Project. And in our work on emerging technologies and critical infrastructure, particularly about how we deliver energy, manage water, and secure systems, we ask a series of questions. Who is connected? Who is protected? And who is left out of the picture? So from where I sit, this is the challenge before us. Yes. And in our work, we think about infrastructure as being digital, physical, and social. And all of these are under pressure from climate change, evolving security threats, and economic inequality. And they don't exist in silos, they converge. We've seen this in some of the work that we've done in particular communities. And we do work in all kinds of communities across the United States and in the Americas. And so one of these is in rural Iowa, where flood-prone communities, where particularly farmers and lower income American farmers, as well as immigrants from all over this hemisphere, are doing agricultural work, find themselves in a space where commercial agriculture contributes to polluted waters. Also, industrial facilities are causing air quality issues. These facilities also have very low compliance records when it comes to workers and human rights. And so what happens is when we have an event, like a series of tornadoes or other storms, you've got people facing polluted water, damaged roads, and loss of income. There's also very little internet access and digital infrastructure. And so that means they're not able to apply for aid or track recovery funding that's supposed to make its way into their communities. And then in our work in Puerto Rico, which started after Hurricane Maria and continues even looking at the damage from Hurricane Erin, which did not make landfall, but still contributed greatly to severe flooding on the island as well as power outages, the continual failing and fragility of the power grid has cascaded into inequitable access to communications across the island. So your ability to obtain work, to log on and get weather alerts, to understand your risk, to be able to apply for assistance, whether that's Social Security or emergency relief, is very different in Atuado versus Bayamón. And so we've looked at that. And what's happened is that water delivery and medical systems in particular are fragile in Puerto Rico, where you have most of your rural and marginalized populations. And so all of these risks, plus the very complicated relationship with the United States, converge to put the poorest and those who need access to all of the benefits that internet infrastructure and the rapidity of being able to communicate and work digitally with the least amount of these benefits available to them. It necessitates us thinking not just in the present, but looking towards the future as to asking these questions of who's protected, who's connected, and who's left out when we're thinking about tools. And so rural women, irrespective of what country or state you are in, tend to bear the highest burden of whatever kind of risk you're talking about. If we're talking about digital exclusion, work exclusion, security threats in many parts of rural Central America, this is where the cascading impacts of narco trafficking hits rural communities and rural women the hardest. And so how do we make social, physical, and digital investments to uplift them, knowing that when we do gender inclusive budgeting to deal with these cascading risks, we're actually uplifting the entire community and understanding how the specific needs of women actually contributes across the community. And then because I know that I'm speaking to parliamentarians and I spent many years working for parliamentarians, it's the how is one of the questions that always has to be answered. And so community data hubs, thinking about mobile water and energy infrastructure, as well as inclusive consultations, are all endpoints to the kinds of steps that can be taken. So what do I mean by this? Legislation requires data. And the question is, where do we get the data from? Is it from people in think tanks or academia like myself? And that answer is yes. But also thinking about how we can empower civil society and community-based organizations to help us with risk and vulnerability assessments so that we actually get ground truth verified data hubs from the community to help us articulate legislation that's more inclusive of the lived experiences of the people that we serve. Also, when we think about zoning and how we budget, not just siloing it project by project, but thinking about how these different systems converge. Because we often think about water fragility, runs off electricity, and is sometimes managed by digital tools. So where I live, which is a high income community, our water infrastructure is already networked and can be controlled remotely by many of the water facility employees. And they can do everything from manage pollutants and additives to the water, as well as understanding the water levels in the ecosystems from which our municipal water comes. That's all running on digital infrastructure. So if somebody is unconnected, they cannot be a part of this conversation. And so understanding that resilience is not just a project by project endeavor. It is thinking about things at the systems level. And so how can we legislate or generate or advocate for policy that works in systems as well as dealing with immediate needs that are put before us by our constituents. And then when we talk about inclusion, it's understanding that having fora is extremely important in town halls and listening to people, but then also understanding how we can share platforms and translate those fora into data and into points of action. So how does what's communicated in these four translate into different policy levers that then can be used for equitable action from people who are trying to work on behalf of their constituents? And so we always say equity is designed and not assumed, and this is true across whatever theme that we're working on. And so how do we get there? And these are some of the approaches that we talk about as to how do we get there. And then finally, one thing that I like to leave people with when I enter conversations like this is that when we think about security, in the opening statement is thinking about social and health and all of the things that intersect with the physical infrastructure. Infrastructure resilience really is people-centered security, because anywhere something is built, there are people interacting with it, who live around it, who depend on it for their livelihood. And so when we're thinking about how we harden these things, actually, quote unquote, hardening the community is just as important in these conversations as the critical infrastructure is.
As part of the panel, member of the Legislative Assembly of Costa Rica and board member of ParlAmericas, Carolina Delgado Ramirez, invited Professor Monica Sanders to share her thoughts on forward-looking strategies that parliamentarians in the Americas and Caribbean should consider. Ms. Delgado specifically asked about gender-informed strategies and data-driven tools that could be adopted to ensure that infrastructure innovation and regulation empower all segments of society, including women and marginalized communities, while building long-term resilience.
You know, some things that legislative and executive branches can do together is auditing energy access and water security along with internet connectivity, and using that information from ministries and agencies, depending on what you call them in your country, to inform how we design legislation. And I'll give you an example. In my work here in the United States with the United States Geological Survey, we were able to take some of their data from drought and heat monitoring and put that into an app that we did two things with. On one end of it, we helped women farmers in the Midwest be able to put in their zip code and understand the hazard in front of them. But then also we were able to take that same information and translate it into policy interventions, saying like, here's what you should be thinking about when you're talking about requesting funding for dam infrastructure or for new pipes or in thinking about where we're going to lay these things. And so making sure that when we're using our data use, that it's gender informed, reaching back to those same populations when we began this, that I said are most marginalized. Well, that's also oftentimes where the action and the solutions also lie, is with these people. Secondly, it's about using community data integration. And so working with indigenous populations who oftentimes have data, it's just not presented in a way that we understand it as policymakers and researchers. And so working with organizations that can translate those experiences into data. And I'll give you an example from my home state of Louisiana. There's a group called the Isleños who are originally from the Canary Islands off the coast of Spain. And they document their history and the history of land in these songs called décimas. Each new leader of the Isleños has to learn all of the décimas from the leader ahead of him or her. Well, what we learned is in these songs has been an accounting of the changes in the coast. And so we went through and used AI to pull all of the language about the coastal degradation from the songs and attach them to a point in time. And now we have community informed information about the coastal degradation risk to the Isleño population. And we can take that and turn that into, it's not a football field that we're losing, it's this many meters, and we attached it to the history of these folks. And now we can give you something so that you can measure it and make accurate policy. And this came from a language marginalized group. And so here's how we can integrate history and things that we've known all of our lives and our lived experiences into policy tools and forward-thinking interventions that can help these communities. And then also thinking about in terms of regional collaboration and moving towards more open data initiatives. And I recognize that we're in a place where I think we're going to start creating a new term called data fragility in the United States, where publicly available data is of varying levels of access depending on what's going on in the country. But moving towards open data storages and open data dashboards throughout the region can help us share this information more effectively, and also making sure that the people at the table in creating and managing these dashboards are reflective of the communities, particularly with women, because I believe the World Bank said as an end of 2024, 50.8% of the population in our hemisphere is female. And so the common sense is we can't have an integrated approach if half of the population cannot access and manage and articulate the data and the interventions. So to put a fine point on it, any of these solutions that I put forward or that others put forward, that it just makes sense according to the statistics to make sure that people who identify as women are included, but that we do it in an open and inclusive way. Because remember, equity is designed and not assumed. Thank you all so much for having me be a part of this.